All right, so, excuse me. Session. Here in Texas, there were 21 military posts with about 2,700 federal troops under the command of Major General D.E. Twiggs. Now, Twiggs was a guy who was from Georgia and already in sympathy with the South. And he asked his supervisors for instructions as to what he should do, and he never got any word back. But why does that say Henry McCullough? It should say Ben. When Ben McCullough, military commander representing the convention, the Confederate Convention, led an armed force to San Antonio, Twiggs agreed to evacuate the 160 troops in San Antonio and surrender to McCullough and the committee all federal property. And on February 18th, he agreed to the evacuation of all other forts in Texas under similar terms. This pretty much enabled the Confederate Convention, without the firing of a shot, to put out of action more than 10% of the regular army of the United States and acquire military supplies and property valued at $3 million. Now, elsewhere, of course, the evacuation of federal troops didn't go as smoothly. Perhaps most prominent is the case of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Where basically, rather than see the fort there get re-provisioned with food, and remember, South Carolina was the first state that ceded under the Confederacy, and there, in their capital city in the harbor, was a federal fort flying the U.S. flag, kind of like big middle finger, and overeager. I want to make sure I'm recording this. Am I recording? An overeager, Confederates on that morning of April 12th, 1861, went ahead and opened fire on the fort, where it lasted for more than a day of full cannonade with no casualties. So America's bloodiest war started with nobody dying. But now Texas is caught up in the winds of war. Now, Texas was a border state in the Confederacy. It was exposed to attack from the north, from the west, and the south. So the first area we're going to look at is up in the north. Because remember, up in Oklahoma, which was Indian territory back then, there were federal forts near the reservations. So W.C. Young, former sheriff and resident of Cook County, led a volunteer regiment of Texas Cavalry across the Red River and took Forts Arbuckle, Cobb, and Washita without firing a shot. Thereby making invasion from the north unlikely. Now, we had to deal throughout the whole of the Civil War with the problem of Indian raids. And this problem had troubled Texas for more than a century and a half. So it wasn't going to be a problem that was solved easily. The Confederacy assigned a Texas regiment under Rip Ford the attack of guarding the Rio Grande frontier from Fort Brown near the Gulf Coast to Fort Bliss near the site of El Paso. But in early 1861, basically the defense was up to small little militia groups of Minutemen. But in 1862, a frontier regiment was organized under James Norris, who established a chain of 16 posts along the frontier from the Red River to the Rio Grande, and regular patrols along that line. Now, even though we started out good and strong, basically with each year that force was weakened and weakened as the demands of the Confederacy took our troops to other theaters. And we got away with it till October of 1864, when about 200 Comanches and Kiowas attacked settlements near Fort Belknap in Young County, killing 16, capturing 7 others. And during the last 2 years of the war, another thing that we had to defend ourselves from was deserters from the Confederate Army. But basically they created confusion along the frontier. And in January of 1865, at Dove Creek, a few miles southwest of present-day San Angelo, state militia joined Confederate troops of the Frontier Regiment, giving a force of about 380 men strong that were going to attack about 600 to 1,000 Kickapoo Indians. The Kickapoo, who were migrating from Indian Territory up in Oklahoma to Mexico, inflicted heavy losses on their attackers, and thereafter pretty much maintained a hostile attitude towards the Texans. So that's pretty much to the north and the frontier. Now we're going to look out to the west. The most aggressive campaign in which the Texans participated was an effort to occupy New Mexico. John R. Baylor, commander of a detachment of Texas troops, marched into New Mexico territory, and on August 1st, 1861, issued a proclamation establishing the territory of Arizona. Later, with Baylor as governor, the constitutional government was established in Arizona. And for a short while, Confederate troops occupied the country as far west as Tucson. Then in early 1862, General H.H. Sibley, with 3 regiments of Texans, sought to drive the Federals out of New Mexico. He defeated a force of over 3,800 at Val Verde on February 2nd, 1862. and took Albuquerque and Santa Fe. This right here is the flag for the Confederate Army of New Mexico. That red flag with the star. Their successful march onward, however, was stopped on March 28th at Glorieta Pass, where the Federals not only checked his advance, but more importantly, they destroyed his supply train. And as basically the Federals had followed a scorched earth policy in the retreat of like Albuquerque and Santa Fe, where they like destroyed everything, we pretty much had to return to Texas. With the shattered remnants of his troops, returning to San Antonio in the summer of 1862. So we talked about the North, we talked about the West. Now let's talk about the East. The defense of the Texas coast was far more successful. In July of 1861, the Union forces extended their blockade to include Texas. And before a formidable foe, basically the Confederates withdrew from Galveston, allowing a federal occupation. On October 1862, but John B. Magruder, who had led campaigns east of the Mississippi River and was now in command of the Department of Texas, was determined to recover this town. So with two riverboats that I guess we could call cotton-clads, because basically they were protected by bales of cotton from enemy fire, and about 300 veterans of Sibley's New Mexico campaign serving as Marines moved against it by sea. A land force was concentrated at Virginia Point, opposite of Galveston. And on January 1st, 1863, the combined forces took Galveston. And it's so weird, because that fort that was, the force that was at Virginia Point, you have this amphibious landing and assault from gunboats. Meanwhile, you have the Confederates using a railroad bridge from Virginia Point to Galveston that basically used that to cross over the water and attack the city. With a loss of 26 killed and 117 wounded, the Federals suffered the loss of 2 warships and 414 men killed or captured. But 4 Federal gunboats made their escape. But then we also have the Battle of Sabine Pass. Now, Sabine Pass was kind of at the mouth of the Sabine River. And guys, here's the fort itself. I guess there's the mouth, but here's the fort. And it wasn't magnificent at all. It was cannon it was kind of in earthenworks. And basically Dick Dowling and his 47 Irishmen would use their time to practice their gunnery skills. When they weren't slapping away mosquitoes that were biting them. And in 1862, a Federal blockade patrol forced the Confederates to abandon it, but after retaking Galveston, the Confederates on January 21st reoccupied and fortified the post at Sabine Pass, Fort Griffin. But Union leaders, Admiral David G. Farragut, that's the guy who captured New Orleans, the guy who also said damn the torpedoes when he was talking about mines, and General N.P. Banks planned for a major campaign against Texas that would begin with the retaking of the Sabine Pass. He had 4 gunboats, 23 transports, more than 5,000 troops for his initial landing. Slowly he approached the outlet guarded by Fort Griffin on September 8, 1863. Basically, all Dick Dowling had was a small gunboat and a garrison of 46 men. But he was able to disable 2 of the gunboats, excuse me, and captured 2 more enemy craft, taking about 350 prisoners. This caused the whole expedition to be turned back. And guys, if it hadn't been for Dick Dowling and his men, those guys would have made a successful landing. Indeed, Jefferson Davis was so awestruck by the effect that the Davis Guard, because that's what Dick Dowling's men were called, that he had special medals made for Dick Dowling and his 46 men. And these are the only medals that were ever made by the Confederate government. So it was seen as a huge deal, because that basically would have caught Texas unprepared. All right, more to the east. Banks' next thrust was more successful. With a combined naval and land force of about 7,000 men, he moved against the lower Rio Grande, where the Confederate garrisons were pitifully weak, beginning by taking the island of Brazos de Santiago off the mouth of the Rio Grande on November 1st, 1863. He was then able to threaten Brownsville, Corpus Christi, Aransas Pass, Indianola, leaving only Galveston, Port Lavaca, and Sabine Pass as ports available to the Confederates. Now guys, y'all know where Brownsville is, right? You know where Brownsville, Texas is? Way down at the tippy tip. Okay, there's Brownsville, Texas, right at the bottom. And there's Mexico right across from it, Matamoros. Okay? And the reason why they took Brazos Santiago was because so much cotton was flowing through Texas and going down and getting traded in Baghdad, which is Matamoros. And it was funneling up money to the Confederacy. And so they wanted to put a stop to that. And so in the spring of 1864, Banks made a last campaign against Texas in the Red River Campaign. From Alexandria, Louisiana, he had 25,000 well-equipped veterans, sustained by a flotilla of gunboats that moved up the Red River. However, the Confederates and the East Texans from the country fought against it and were able to push back that attack. All the way back into Louisiana, a place like Mansfield, Shreveport, finally pushing them all the way to the Mississippi River. And in the summer of 1864, Confederate forces under John S. Ford, or Rip Ford, recaptured Fort Brown and took control of the mainland of South Texas, where Federals had already withdrawn some of their troops. Indeed, the last battle of the Civil War was fought in the Valley in the spring of 1865. On May 13th at Palmetto Ranch, Ford and a force of 300 men defeated 2 Federal regiments. Basically, the Union general was looking for a last taste of glory to advance his political career, because apparently they knew that the Civil War was over, because that's how Rick Ford learned, oh, the Civil War is already over, because the word hadn't gotten to Texas yet. Okay, supplying men. All right, now one of the biggest benefits that Texas was to the Confederacy was in supplying soldiers. I mean, as early as September 30th, 1861, 10 regiments of Texas troops had already been organized. And early in 1862, Governor Lubbock received a call for 15 regiments of infantry and volunteers. And according to his memoirs, he supplied these in a few months. And he figured that Texas had about 20,000 members in military service before the conscription acts began. And conscription, that's kind of like the draft, where they force you into the military. The first was passed April 16th, 1862. Basically, it applied to men from 18 to 45 years of age. In September, the age limit was raised, and a later act extended the limits from 17 to 50 years old. On December 25th, 1861, the state provided for the enrollment and organization of a militia, and on an act in 1863 provided that the militia might be transferred for Confederate service for a period of more than a year. But there were some exemptions that allowed some to avoid military service. Like if you were a Confederate office holder, if you were an owner of a large number of slaves, if you were a person that was supposedly indispensable to the professions, agriculture, or industry. as well as Texans that were responsible for the frontier defense, were exempt. And if you had the money, you could buy a substitute. Basically, a guy to show up in your stead. It's so funny though, because while I was pursuing graduate studies in history at the University of North Texas, this guy that we were just given random names of Texas officers, and we had to do a historical study of them. Anyway, this guy was kind of a rascal, but like in 1863, he basically worked as an overseer for the Confederate Army because there weren't enough men in the area, there were lots of slaves, and that basically was his position. Weird. And I had never seen or heard of something like that before, but papers were there. Of course, the guy was a rascal. Now, supplying men, so we supplied 2 full generals. Here's both of their monuments. Well, this is the guy's grave. Anybody ever been to the Texas State Cemetery? It's in Austin. The road that runs through it is the smallest highway in the state of Texas. But it's considered a highway. Like Stephen F. Austin is buried there. And here's kind of like a shrine to Albert Sidney Johnson, who was a full general that was given to the Confederacy. Here on the grounds of the Texas State Capitol is John Bell Hood, who fought in numerous battles in the Civil War. We also gave a Major General, John H. Wharton, 34 Brigadier Generals, 97 Colonels, indeed here in Texas, as many as 75 to 80% of the men who were able to serve did so. Even though as the war approached its ending days, more and more deserters coming back. Texans fought on every battlefront, and hosts of witnesses vouched for their valor, their mobility, and their heroic daring. For example, you have the cavalry unit led by B.F. Frank Terry, or Terry's Texas Rangers. Once again, there's a photo of the young Rangers, and there's a monument to Terry's Texas Rangers on our Capitol. You also had like Ross's Texas Brigade, Hood's Texas Brigade. Basically, our troops took part in seemingly endless campaigns in Arkansas and Louisiana. The state and the Confederacy. Well, the state saw, basically, once it got rid of Sam Houston, our Confederate governor was Francis Richard Lubbock. And most of his efforts, as well as the efforts of the state, were centered on winning the war because the governor supported the Confederacy. And most of legislation pertained to its defense. Basically, you also did have like bond issues passed to raise revenue for the governor, for the Confederacy, the collection of debts. When there was some Confederate reversals, as well as Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, Lubbock called for an extra session of the legislature, which more than doubled taxes and appropriated $600,000 for the use of needy families of soldiers, and $200,000 as a hospital fund for those wounded Texans in the Confederate cause. Brigadier General P.O. Hubert, a West Point valedictorian and former governor of Louisiana, became commander of the Department of Texas, the military Department of Texas, and created considerable resentment when in May of 1862 he proclaimed martial law for the entire state in order to enforce the conscription law. Now, critics of the Confederacy. The rank and file of Union sympathizers may be classified into three groups. Those who, despite their Union sympathies, accepted the decision of the state electorate as binding upon them and supported the Confederate cause. The next group was those who tried to remain neutral. And lastly, those who left the state or tried to do so. Now, Union sentiment was strongest along the lower Rio Grande, among the Germans, and certain counties in the north. On the lower Rio Grande area, escape to Mexico was easy, and where sometimes the Mexican population refused to support the Confederacy, it became a site for many Unionist refugees, as well as for the recruitment of volunteers for the U.S. Army. Almost 1,000 Mexican Americans did join the Union Army, but as can be seen over here, 2,500 Tejanos did join the Confederacy. But getting back to the Germans, in 1861, the Militant Union Loyal League was formed in modern Gillespie, Kerr, and Kendall counties. Had about 500 members. Later on, it was forced to disband. And even though a few Germans left the state, one group of 65 was on its way to Mexico in August of 1862, and it had 34 killed by the Texas militia. Another group of 50 was hung, and others were killed in the German resistance in the western area. Indeed, if you go down to Comfort, Texas today, you can see the True to the Union. It says that in German on the monument. This is by Texas, and I hate this because the flag is like right over here. This also has a flag that is perpetually at half-mast, and they do not take it off the flagpole. It is always flying at half-mast in recognition of these Germans who basically were hung. Now, up in northern Texas, Confederate Army of about 150 men were arrested and tried in Gainesville. You have this whole thing of a secret society called the Peace Party that nobody really knew anything about, but everybody knew of it, but nobody knew like who was in it or anything like that. Anyway, a group of about 150 guys that were just trying to get out of the South, they all get arrested. Now, some of them, of course, were arrested for different reasons. And if you see the video that I played yesterday, I showed part of a guy giving a lecture who was one of my old professors at the University of North Texas, Dr. Richard McCaslin, who basically, he wrote the book on this. And every year he still goes out to Gainesville, and there's still lots of heated discussion about it. Anyway, 150 of these guys are arrested. They try them in people's courts. Now, what are these people? They're not military courts. They're not actual, real, legal courts. They're just people looking over other people. Anyway, about 40 of these people are hung. And I believe it is America's largest mass hanging. And of course, as Dr. McCaslin pointed out, some of this was due to arguments over land ownership and everything like that. But then basically we get sending, hey. Okay. By February of 1863, the problem of desertion had become so serious that General Magruder was urging Governor Lubbock to aid him in suppressing it. But 8 months later, Henry McCulloch, in command of the Northern Sub-Military District, estimated that there were 1,000 deserters in his territory, and he declared that he didn't have sufficient troops to arrest them. Basically, these guys became bush soldiers that caused problems along the frontier. And in Wise, Denton, and neighboring counties, they intimidated local citizens. Slaves, meanwhile, were another group that might have threatened the Confederate war effort, but they seldom caused any problems. They were carefully supervised, and instances of sabotage were isolated. There weren't any rebellions, and the number of runaways increased little. But an interesting thing, of the 47 black soldiers, out of more, just to show you how hard it was to get away from Texas, because either you went to Mexico or good luck getting out of here. 47 of the more than 100,000 black soldiers in the U.S. Army that fought during the Civil War were from Texas. Okay, life at home during the war. Well, the war forced radical readjustments in farming. The demand for cotton declined, and that for food crops increased. Newspapers put out articles pleading for the planting of more corn. Crops were good during the years of the war, and for the most part, no one suffered from lack of food. However, the state found it necessary to appropriate funds to purchase food and other necessities for needy families of soldiers off at war. Basically, county governments took this money, purchased the food, and distributed it to the families. Now, of course, you also had to deal with war shortages, and you had to make various substitutions, like the ashes of burnt corn cobs served as baking soda, parched sweet potato, rye, and okra were substitutes for coffee. About the only thing you couldn't substitute was salt, which was a necessity for livestock as well as for like preserving meat. But it became so scarce that the monthly pay of a soldier couldn't even buy a sack of salt. That's how expensive it was. In industry, as always, there was a lot of people talking, a lot of big plans, a lot of land reserved. Very little amount of it came to anything. There was an arsenal that did open up in Austin. There was supposed to be a limited gun making foundry in Tyler. You did have some iron foundries getting started, as well as tanneries. But there was never enough medication. Hospitals, hospital supplies, and clothing. So in 1864, a serious effort was made by the military authorities to encourage the growing of poppies for opium. And the press frequently called the attention of the public to shrubs and plants of medicinal value. Relief committees received donations and distributed funds and goods for the benefit of the wives and children of soldiers. And in spite of its cost and the hazards of the trade, men would undertake basically getting their cotton down to the Rio Grande River, where it might get from 20 to 72 cents a pound in 1862. And by late 1864, if you were able to get that cotton up to New York, you could sell it from anywhere from 72 cents a pound to $1.90, because they didn't have any of it. So guys, men of non-military age and women made brave efforts to keep up the morale of their communities in spite of the reports of the Confederate reserves and the tragic news of sons and husbands that had passed or been maimed. There are accounts of Christmas celebrations in ordinary times, of parties and receptions for returned soldiers, and of war meetings with stirring speeches and dinners on the ground. But in the final days, it collapsed. And that's about that. And the North one.